Hello and welcome to The Best Time to Plant a Tree, the podcast hosted by me, David Spears, South Australia's Minister for Environment and Water. In this episode, I record an outdoor podcast with Elaine Bensted, the Chief Executive of Zoos SA, and we are recording this conversation sitting in an aviary within Adelaide Zoo, one of South Australia's top tourism destinations, but also a conservation charity which is pushing the boundaries of rewilding and looking after some of South Australia's most threatened species, as well as doing some heavy lifting in international conservation as well. Sit down, listen to a great conversation between me and Elaine Bensted, Chief Executive of Zoos SA. Welcome to the latest edition of The Best Time to Plant a Tree, the podcast hosted by me, David Spears, South Australia's Minister for Environment and Water. And today we are in a very unique location. We're in the Australian Rainforest Aviary at the heart of Adelaide Zoo, really within the central business district of Adelaide itself. We're surrounded by bird life, and the trees above us, the water around us, the sounds and background noises in this podcast are just going to be spectacular for our listeners. But I want to welcome the Chief Executive of Zoos SA to the podcast, Elaine Bensted. Elaine, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, and thanks for joining us at Adelaide Zoo in the beautiful Rainforest Aviary.
I've done a couple of these podcasts outdoors since starting to record these a few weeks ago, but nothing quite like this. Before we launch into the podcast and start working through some questions, can you just tell our listeners where we are and a bit about the bird life flying around us?
Yeah, I mean, we're so very, very lucky with Adelaide Zoo. As you said, it's right in the heart of the CBD. We call it our little city oasis, because when you're here, you feel like you're miles from the city because all you can generally hear is sounds of animals. So this is our Rainforest Aviary. It showcases a whole range of beautiful, stunning Australian bird life, as well as some amazing botanic gardens. And people might not realise, I mean, we've been open to the public as a zoo since 1883. But the actual land that we're on used to be part of the Botanic Gardens, and so we're blessed with some absolutely magnificent gardens, and it just gives a very natural feel. A lot of people come here just to spend a bit of time and feel part of nature.
And of course, all these trees, these mature trees, are not only habitat, but they're keeping us cool. It's an autumn evening here in Adelaide as we record this, but you can feel that sense of cool provided by the shade of the trees and just the lushness around us, which of course is one of the benefits of having your botanic garden location. Absolutely.
Even on those really hot, sort of 40-degree plus days, walking through Adelaide Zoo, you instantly feel cooler because of that lushness. And here comes the noise of the birds.
Birds flying over us, and we're at closing time in the zoo. Our listeners will be able to hear the announcement in the background telling visitors to bring their very happy visit to the zoo to an end by the sounds of it and head home. The zoo is closing for another day, and it sort of conjures up those night at the museum ideas of what happens after hours when the gates are locked and the sun goes down. What does happen in the zoo? And we might come back to that later. But before we dig into the role of a zoo in the 21st century and the role of Zoos SA, Elaine, can you tell us, how did you end up as the Chief Executive of this great organisation?
Yeah, and it certainly wasn't a standard career path. I came into this role at the end of 2012, so it's been into my 9th year now. But I actually grew up wanting to be a vet, and that was really all I ever wanted to do. We came out from Scotland when I was quite young.
So your accent isn't quite like mine. Maybe once it was.
I was a touch younger when we arrived. Mum and Dad came out with 4 kids and made the move to the other side of the world. And as I said, growing up, it was all I ever wanted to do was be a vet. And I had it all planned. I was going to move to Perth because there wasn't a veterinary school back in Adelaide in those days. And then in year 12, it sort of dawned on me that I wasn't going to grow out of the fact that I'm really squeamish. I can't stand blood, can't stand injections.
Slight problem.
I'm really not enjoying watching all of the news at the moment, where all you see is people getting injections. Too much for me. So I ended up going to university, and I was doing a science degree because I'd picked all my subjects around being a vet, and then realised I didn't actually want to be a scientist. So I dropped out and started a different career and worked in the private sector in banking and finance, but really went into marketing and human resources and training. And then had a stint in local government before joining the state government, and was an executive in the South Australian state government for about 12 years. The last 7 of which was as Chief Executive of TAFE here in South Australia, the vocational education provider. And literally saw the job of Chief Executive Zoos SA advertised, and it was like, oh, that'd be a cool job. And luckily for me, I guess at the time, the board were looking for someone more to manage the business of Zoos SA, because the organisation was in quite a bit of... Sorry, I just got swooped by that.
Yes.
Was in quite
it's a little
bit of,
distracting when these birds almost land in our heads.
We
but
get used to it.
We'll put up with it. We'll work through that.
So yes, I mean, the zoo had always, I guess, had chief executives who had been part of the zoo industry or biology or veterinary background, and I didn't have that. But I've always been passionate as a conservationist and environmentalist and absolutely an animal lover. But the board were looking more for someone to run the business. And that's where I came in.
And the zoo had gone through a fairly difficult time. When you arrived here, it was probably at one of its most difficult times. And as you said, that's why you were brought in. But I don't think we'd ever want to see an iconic institution like this go bankrupt. And I'm sure the government of the day wouldn't have allowed that. In fact, they didn't allow it. But it was pretty touch and go at times, wasn't it?
It certainly was. There was the first 2 years were, I mean, the zoo had been operating in a deficit for many, many years. And then with the global financial crisis hitting, that meant that a lot of corporate partnerships, which we're quite reliant on, but there was also, there'd been a lot of growth, and the zoo ended up with a debt that just simply couldn't be serviced. So, yeah, it was certainly an extraordinarily tough couple of years, and then we moved into recovery mode and everything was looking swimmingly until this little hiccup called COVID appeared, and it's certainly been a very tough last 12 months.
Well, that is a good segue into the impacts of COVID-19. The zoo is one of South Australia's most significant visitor attractions. It's a tourism destination. It is very reliant on a steady stream of visitors, not just locals from Adelaide, but people from across the state and interstate and overseas. Well, the overseas ones have been completely taken out over the last 12 months. The interstate ones have been hugely curtailed, and because of some of those COVID rules, we also haven't been able to have the usual crowds, the usual visitation numbers. What has the impact been on the zoo, and how are you working towards recovery?
Yeah, it was interesting, Minister. It was just a couple of weeks ago we hosted a staff barbecue, which was to, I guess, mark 12 months to the day that we announced we were closing. And as I said to them, I've been working for 40 years, and certainly the last 12 months was by far and away the most challenging that I've ever worked through. Like many businesses, when we closed, our revenue streams literally stopped overnight, but most of our expenditure doesn't. We've
got to still feed all these animals.
They eat just as much whether there's one visitor or no visitors.
This frogmouth sitting right behind us still requires its mice to be dropped into its mouth every few hours, probably.
Yeah, so it was really challenging when we announced that we were closing our doors. At that stage, JobKeeper hadn't been announced, so we stood down nearly half of our staff on no pay or reduced their hours or reduced their pay, but they were working more hours, which is really my management team. And we had no idea how long that was going to be for. And I remember on the day telling the staff and saying, Adelaide Zoo opened in 1883, and in all that time, there's only been one day that we've been closed to the public. We'd been open through the Spanish flu, open through a couple of world wars and a Great Depression. So to close the doors and not know how long it was going to be for was really challenging. It ended up being nearly 3 months, so we reopened at the end of June. So for us, incredibly impacting, but I think the Australian government and the South Australian government were never going to let zoos fail, and they were never going to let animal welfare suffer. And so we had the JobKeeper support, which was really, really vital for us. We then had some funding support to make sure there was enough to cover animal feed and veterinary supplies. And I know I sit on a number of global zoo committees, and while I thought the last year was really hard, it was nothing compared to some of my counterparts around the world. And now I think we're just in what I call the recovery mode. We're still, Adelaide normally gets about 30% of its visitors from outside of South Australia. That's going to be a little while before that returns, but it's also the really long lead time for events, weddings, conferences. We work really closely with the Convention Bureau and the like. So it's those other revenue streams that will take some time to recover. But I've got an amazing team of both staff and volunteers. They accepted what needed to be done. We're still operating on minimal expenditure and very creative ways of raising revenue.
The COVID-19 situation unfolded just after the bushfires has impacted South Australia in a very dramatic way. The zoo has actually played quite a role in bushfire recovery and in fact received quite a bit of federal funding to work with other charities and the state government and the various landscape boards across the state that were impacted by fire. Can you explain how you entered the COVID-19 era while still providing a really critical bushfire recovery role as well?
You're right, and we've always been involved in bushfire recovery from a species level, but yes, certainly the December fires, the Cuddly Creek fires, and then the horrific fires on Kangaroo Island, we stepped in with immediate veterinary response. So we had a team of vets and vet nurses at Kangaroo Island right up until we weren't able to get them across on the ferry, and that was doing an immediate veterinary work. But we're still on the island and still doing longer term work, which we have received funding to support. So that's doing work with things like Kangaroo Island Dunart. So we work closely with a range of partners, including obviously the Department of Environment and Water. And we find some of those projects, that the veterinary is immediate and it might take 2 or 3 months. But the conservation projects can be years and years and years.
Generational, aren't they? And they have to be to make them work.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the things that good zoos do. We're one of the few organisations that can work at a species level. Your department's working at a sort of landscape level, and we do some of that. We certainly do a range of feral control projects. We do revegetation projects down in the southeast. But we've also got expertise at a species level, so whether that's breeding and holding insurance populations, whether that's doing breeding for release to the wild and rewilding projects, it's where our expertise can really work in partnership with universities from a scientific perspective and come together so that you've got both a landscape approach and a species approach, because both are really needed.
And I think that will, for better or worse, surprise some of our listeners, because I think a lot of people believe that zoos are great visitor attractions. You wander through, you see some interpretive signage that points out particular animals. You've got the favourites around here. You've got the pandas, Wang Wang and Funi. You've got your native species as well. You've got your nature playground, and people can get some refreshments and then head off home when the announcement comes over the intercom, like we've just heard. But actually, this is a conservation charity, probably as much as a visitor destination, if not more so, in terms of your reason for being in the 21st century. I knew before becoming minister that Zoos SA was doing some of this work, but I actually have really come to appreciate much more in the last few years in my role as the state's environment minister, with a close relationship to the zoo of your conservation efforts in our state, in other parts of Australia, and of course in an international context as well. But do you find people are quite surprised to learn of the zoo's role as really one of the state's largest conservation charities?
Yeah, it's something that we're always trying to influence, because you're right, at our heart, we're a conservation charity. Our purpose and our mission is about connecting people with nature, and we can do that through the visitors, but it's about saving species from extinction. A lot of that work does happen behind the scenes. If we're breeding Tasmanian devils for release to Tasmania, we actually don't want them to get too used to visitors and people. In fact, our keepers turn their radios down, and we try and keep them as wild as possible. So a lot of that work is done behind the scenes. Orange-bellied parrots, doing western swamp tortoises, a whole range of species. We work closely to try and use our influence in the media to bring those conservation stories to the fore. I must say it's one of those things that we always struggle in some ways. If we've got a cute fluffy animal, we can always get the media interested. If we've got a really genuine conservation story, we might get a sliver of interest. Even just putting things on our Facebook, if it's a nice cute fluffy story, it'll get thousands of shares and likes.
If it's a koala, for instance.
If it's a conservation story, it doesn't always have that same reach. But I think that is starting to change, and one of the ways people do come to the zoo. We know, our research tells us they come to the zoo to have an enjoyable time with family or friends, to create memories for themselves, and hopefully they learn a bit about conservation while they're here. That's not why they're coming. But
they're coming for a good day out.
They're coming for a good day out, and that's what's raising the money for us.
Yeah, that's the gate fees and the memberships.
Because most of our money does come from our visitors and our members. So it's up to us to make sure they do have a really enjoyable day out. But at the same time, hopefully then try and imbue some of those conservation messages. I think in some ways that's easier to do at Monarto, where most of our visitors hop on one of the Zoo Loop buses and they hear one of our passionate volunteers and they tell the story about conservation.
So it's quite a structured experience done at Monarto.
That's right, whereas Adelaide tends to be people more walking around. But it's also, I think, a real positive with our zoo learning program. We have about 70,000 school formal visits as part of their curriculum. And those students are learning a lot more about our conservation work and about what they can do at home themselves, whether it's about smart use of plastics, whether it's about sustainable palm oil. We can get those messages through to our school students, who can hopefully then go home and change mum and dad's behaviour as well.
One of the benefits of being so close to the CBD is not only are the birds overhead in this aviary, but listeners will also be able to hear those planes taking off from Adelaide Zoo as well.
When we were close to the public for those 3 months, we saw some changes of behaviour in some of our animals. Mujambi, who many people would know as our male lion here, he often roars when a plane goes overhead. And of course there was no planes, hardly any planes for those 3 months.
Yes.
And he went quite quiet until a plane went over, and then he certainly let us know.
The lesser known impacts of COVID-19 right there. So if we look back in history, zoos were really quite often quite elite organisations, or really they were collections held by wealthy people. Back in the UK, they were associated, and still are to an extent, with stately homes. They were collections that aristocrats and pioneers, explorers travelled the world, captured things, popped them on the ship and brought them back to entertain people. And look, that was before animal ethics and things like that, and I'm sure despite that, there was a huge amount of learning came from those collections and the old style zoo. But really, that's certainly not the role of the 21st century zoo. We've got these immersive animal experiences like we're having at the moment, sitting in this aviary. We've got that conservation role. Can you sum up what you see the role of a 21st century zoo as being?
Yeah, and we never hide from our history. We did open in 1883, as I said, and you look back now and you just look in one area of Adelaide Zoo, and we held rhinos, elephant, hippo, all in this really small space. So things have come a long way, and as I said, we've learnt a lot more, and we continue to learn. And we have a lot of discussions. I'm a member of the Zoo and Aquarium Association, and we have a lot of discussions about what's the role of a good zoo, a modern zoo. And we're quite lucky in Australia and New Zealand that the majority of our zoos are good zoos. They put a lot of focus on animal welfare, and they put a lot of focus on conservation activities. Around the world, that's not the case. There are still an awful lot of zoos that are much more like the one you described, and really we should either be trying to improve them or having them closed down. But for me, a good 21st century zoo should always have a focus on animal welfare, should always have a focus on conservation activities, should always have a focus on community education about trying to improve the world and the environment that we all live in. We are very lucky in that we attract a lot of visitors. We're one of the single biggest visitation spaces in the state. And so we can have an enormous impact by sharing messages. We look in South Australia at the single-use plastic legislation. We're in a position that not many organisations are, that we can share that story with over 500,000 people and really inspire change. So for me, a good zoo is one that focuses on conservation, on community education, and very much on animal welfare. People would be quite amazed if they looked at the training and the conditioning that goes that our keeping staff and our veterinary staff work, all aimed at improving health outcomes. We want to minimise giving anaesthetics to animals. So we've got lions that are trained to basically put their tail through the mesh so that the vets can draw blood. And you think
phenomenal.
We do our very best not to pick up any animal and put it into a pet pack if it's then going to visit the vet. It's trained so that it chooses to walk in there. So it's always about what choice does the animal have. We do a range of up-close encounters. They help us raise more funds. They also help people get closer to nature and get that real awe-inspiring if you're doing a lion's 360 and you're a few inches from a lion. But all of those animal experiences are the animal's choice. Does it choose to come and participate? They nearly always do, because we make it a positive experience for them. So I think good zoos have come a long way and will continue to evolve and develop.
The makeup, the blend of species in a zoo is obviously changing over time, particularly in Australian zoos, as some of those older animals, the much-loved animals, pass away. Some of these animals have huge longevity. I think of your hippo that passed away recently. You had the oldest flamingo in the world. I think it died in its 80s, didn't it? And but it's harder to get some of these species now, and again for good reason, for animal welfare and ethical reasons, and the blend of animals available to zoos is changing. Can you talk a little bit about that and what the future makeup of your species collection is likely to be?
Yeah, it's a really, really interesting question. When I started, we posed a question about why do we house the animals that we have, and we have a tool that helps us choose that. Because it's not enough just to say we want one of everything, which was pretty much the old day, the sort of postcard.
It was sort of tick
selection.
the box.
That's right.
Yeah.
Whereas now we really want animals that are either that we're involved in a conservation program with them, or that we're involved in an education program. So, for example, Sumatran tigers, only 400 left in the wild. So what role can a Sumatran tiger in a zoo play? Obviously, there's an insurance population if we're successful in breeding, but they also help tell the story about the damage that's been done by unsustainable palm oil. So why do we have the animal? What purpose does it serve? How does it help develop that mission of conservation? And then is it feasible to continue to hold that species in Australia? Most of our animals, we have a stud book. It's actually quite a scientific process of working out who should breed with who. It's not just all left to chance. It's very structured, particularly for endangered animals. So, for example, just recently our female Sumatran tiger unfortunately had to be euthanised. She was found to have a lot of tumours. They are so critically endangered. We're now working globally to work out who's the best female to potentially bring to Australia to be a mating partner. But Australia has very, very challenging quarantine and biosecurity rules for good reasons, because we are disease-free in many ways. So at the moment, there's a lot of species we simply can't bring into
and
Australia.
bird life in particular. So the idea of replacing the much-loved flamingos after they passed away, that's almost impossible, isn't it?
Look, it could be possible. We work with Department of Agriculture, but it's done on a priority basis. They have to do what we call an import risk assessment, and just with resources within the Commonwealth Department, the zoo industry really has to direct where do we think that priority should be. And at the moment, we can't bring hippos or giraffes or rhinos into Australia. They'd probably rank higher because while I adore flamingos and they were such a big part of Adelaide Zoo's history, they're not endangered. So where do we put our energy and effort?
So to have a flamingo here would almost be an indulgence when actually there's a much greater conservation priority with some of those other larger species.
Quite definitely, and we're involved with the Australian Rhino Project, with a project to try and develop an insurance population of southern white rhinos, and we've really modelled the project very much on the Australian Tassie Devil project. Tassie Devils are a little bit easier to move around, but to try and bring an additional 30 southern white rhinos from Africa into Australia. They've got to go via New Zealand. They do 12 months quarantine in New Zealand, then they come to Australia and do quarantine again here. They're big, expensive projects, but they're so critical because if we don't, we are going to lose southern white rhinos, and it's a species that, the world should never ever lose. So we won't give up hope on those. That takes our energy and focus more so than the flamingo at the moment.
So let's dig into that rhino project in a bit more detail, because that does allow us to talk about not here in Adelaide CBD, but travelling 75, 80 kilometres down the freeway to Monarto, the other site that Zoos SA has operated for many years. Can you give us a little bit about Monarto's history, why we have and it's a safari park these days, it's branded as such. It's I guess what I would see as that traditional safari park experience, and the Rhino project is really at the heart of Monarto's focus these days.
Yeah, so we're very lucky at Zoos SA to have two totally different sites. Adelaide, small, luscious, very close to the CBD, very green, and particularly focuses on Australian and Asian species. Monarto is about an hour's drive from Adelaide and is currently over 1,000 hectares and about to grow to be over 1,500 hectares, with a focus on probably Australian and African animals. It first came to fruition when the state government at the time was looking at setting up a satellite city. And when that didn't proceed, there'd been this ex-farming land that had been purchased. So the board of the Royal Zoological Society, as we are, put a proposal that we have access to the land to be used as a breeding and an agistment area. So for the first 10 years of its life, it wasn't open to the public, but it was used to house larger animals and breeding them. It then opened to the public back in the mid-90s and has been really developing ever since, and is just on the cusp of significant new and exciting developments which will really take it to its next iteration. We were lucky to secure funding from both state and Commonwealth government, and now supported also by the rural city of Murray Bridge, to build a new visitor centre. Because our current visitor centre, it's lovely, but it was built back in 97. We probably had about 15,000 visitors a year. It was probably scoped for about 60,000 visitors a year. We're now about 180,000 and growing. So it just simply isn't big enough. So that's a building project that's underway at the moment. And with the funding secured for the building of the new visitor centre, we have support from a private partner, Mr. Jerry Ryan, who's building accommodation on site. And for us, he'll run the accommodation, we'll run the animal safari that goes with it. But it'll be the largest African safari experience in the world outside of Africa, and yet it's only an hour's drive from Adelaide.
So this is incredibly exciting, and I know that the Cabinet and led by Premier Stephen Marshall has just been 100% behind this project. That's why we're so excited to give the state contribution. We believe in this project. We think and I know I'm speaking to the converted because you're the greatest proponent of the project, but we see this as really being this unique international destination. A lot of people don't feel that they can go to Africa. I'm very fortunate. I've been to Africa several times, but we're in an uncertain world. We certainly can't go to Africa today, but a lot of people would feel uncomfortable going to Africa. I think from my point of view, having visited Monarto, it's probably as close as you could get to Africa while being in the relative safety and comfort of being a short drive from an Australian capital city. And I can just see almost that site just emerging as a set of scenes from The Lion King, and we shouldn't want to stereotype too much, but your visitors will be drawn to that experience, and there'll be water holes, there'll be iconic trees sprouting on the horizon. You'll be able to hear the lions roar and the other collection of species make their noises as the sun goes down. You can just hear it, you can see it, and I think it's something we should be very excited about that's unfolding not that far from Adelaide.
It's incredibly exciting, because that was the one thing that really gave us all a sense of hope through the last 12 months with the COVID challenges that we had to face, that we always had a couple of clear intents when COVID hit. We wanted the ongoing survival of the zoo. We wanted to preserve our staff's jobs, and I'm really pleased that we've been able to do that so far. We wanted to make sure animal welfare and our conservation focus was able to continue, and we wanted to make sure that the Monarto developments continued. So they are full steam ahead. In fact, the builders have been on site since January for the new visitor centre. The builders arrived today to start the earthworks on the hotel. So it will be absolutely a world-class facility. And for us, it's, we're not in the business of running accommodation. Jerry and his team will do that. We will showcase an amazing safari experience. It will allow us also, though, to raise more money for conservation. Everybody who stays overnight, part of their accommodation fee will go into a conservation fund. So there's always more that we need to do, both in Australia and overseas, for conservation work, and this will allow us to raise the critical money that will help us do that. We'll also open up opportunities for the whole Murraylands region, and we've got a great relationship with the Murray Bridge Council and the Regional Development Australia Board. We work with the wineries. People will be able to do an early morning safari and then maybe go out down to Langhorne Creek, do some first-class wine tasting, come back and have an amazing evening, do some Indigenous walking trails. We've got some bush plants that are growing really nicely, so we can tell the story about Australia and about Africa. We're very excited that it's only about 15 months away.
It is. It's very exciting, and from the Premier down, there's a lot of South Australians who are very enthusiastic about what's going to unfold down there. The rhino is going to be a key part of it. This place is going to be the home of the rhinos that find themselves in South Australia. How many animals within the insurance population that's being established in Australia will call Monarto home, and how do you see that unfolding?
Yeah, so there's been work done from a genetic modelling point of view that we really hope to build the southern white rhino population to about 100 in Australia and New Zealand. So that needs us to bring in, our current planning is to bring another 30 rhinos in. They will join ourselves, Arana in Christchurch in New Zealand, at Taronga Western Plains Zoo at Dubbo, and then we will continue our breeding program. We would see Monarto being home to about 40 southern white rhinos, which will be absolutely phenomenal. We're also working and with the water holes, and we had a partnership with SA Water. I don't think I've ever seen anyone quite as excited as my director of Monarto, Peter Clark, when we first switched on a tap and got some water at Wild Africa, because for us that's a game changer. So we're hoping,
because it's a pretty dry place down there.
It's a very dry
Monarto.
place, but we now have 8 water holes, and hoping that we could house some Nile hippos as well around them. So you could be sitting having your gin and tonic, looking over, seeing some hippos as well as rhinos, giraffes, a whole range of Inyala and African species. And we are now starting to bring some animals into what we call Wild Africa. So it's definitely moving ahead really quickly.
So do you foresee the rhinos establishing a successful breeding population there? Do they breed easily?
Look, I think probably because of the way Monarto is structured, we've had incredible success in breeding a whole range of species that generally are quite difficult to breed. So things like cheetah are really, really hard to breed in captivity, and yet we've had quite a high level of success. I think because we tend to have fairly large numbers of the species and they've got lots of room, it is much more natural. And so yes, we are very hopeful that we will continue breeding success with southern white rhinos. We'd also love to expand into black rhinos as well, who are actually even more critically endangered than whites. We currently only hold 2 males, but we have a corporate partner in Gold Rhino who are funding some expansion work for the black rhinos, which will free up the ability for us to hopefully try and source a female black rhino, probably from America, and then start a black rhino breeding program. These projects always take a long, long time to develop and a long time to fund. We're incredibly fortunate that we have some passionate supporters, private donors and corporate partners who help bring some of these to fruition. But it's one of the reasons for the accommodation project is it will help diversify our revenue and allow us to do more of these projects.
What is your hope around the visitation trajectory at Monarto? You said you were up towards, was 100
We should be about 180,000 this year, subject to no more shutdowns. We certainly are planning for next financial year to be over 200,000 and then up to 225,000 within a year after that. Jerry's hoping that his overnight accommodation will have about 40,000 overnight stays. And that for the region is really exciting because, you know, while we've got 180,000 people, they're people who go have a great day, hopefully at Monarto, but then they leave the region. So by having, say, 40,000 of those stay in the region, they will then be able to go out and spend in the local economy. So it's not just a benefit to Zoos South Australia, but to the entire region. And there is, you know, some fabulous partners we're working with on the Murray River. There's so much to showcase within a very close distance.
I think the government is really appreciative of the zoo taking a leadership role here because accommodation in regional South Australia is one of the challenges in our tourism economy. I do a lot of tourism work alongside the Minister for Tourism, who is the Premier, and we are very excited and grateful that we're seeing a real potential accommodation hub developing there in a place where you would never have imagined it in the past, and the opportunity is endless. I think one of the great things about Monarto is that if it does really go gangbusters, there's a lot of opportunity to expand the offering and continue to innovate and evolve there.
Quite definitely, and you know, if you look at what's happening in the Murraylands region, you know, obviously there was the Tail and Bend motor park development, the Bridgeport Hotel opening up, and we've already had meetings with the Bridgeport because we very much see that if you develop the whole region, then it's a tourism product and we can all grow the pie. It's not about being in competition, and certainly the Bridgeport Hotel have that same concept because we offer very, very different products. And I think it's about attracting more people into South Australia region, and we have got a world-class facility that we can really showcase.
It's going to be very exciting, and I'm sure many listeners will be excited to see that unfold in the coming 12 to 24 months. Want to come back from Monarto and focus in now on the South Australian conservation. We talked about Zoos SA being a conservation charity, both with Australian natives and also with those iconic international species like the rhino. But your conservation efforts in South Australia are really looking at some of those species that are facing extinction right here in our own backyard. We hear about those species like rhino, elephants, the international species, the big four or the big five in Africa that have those particular threats facing them. But actually, Australia is the capital of extinction, and not a medal or a moniker that we want to wear. But it's true. It's the reality. We're an extensively cleared landscape, and as a result of very efficient pioneers, and we have done some pretty terrible things to our native species, particularly our mammals. And the zoo is right in there, working with the with other charities, other partners, the Department for Environment and Water and its predecessor agencies, getting alongside them as well as other charitable organisations. Can you talk us through how the zoo goes about working to re-establish particular creatures in South Australia? So one region that I'd like us to think about is the project down at the bottom of the Yorke Peninsula, the Great Southern Arc, or Marna Bangara in the language of the traditional owners of that part of South Australia. So I'm talking around the Innes National Park, famous, iconic national park, now called Dilba-Garunda Innes National Park. We've given it a co-name in the last 6 months. But can you tell us about how the zoo has partnered with the state government and a few other organisations to make Marna Bangara a reality?
And I must say I really love this project, the Marna Bangara, and we have been involved for many years, since inception really of the thinking, because for us it meets all of the criteria that we look at before we decide to get involved in a conservation project. It does have on-ground partnerships, so a lot of time and effort speaking to landowners, to farmers, to the Indigenous. It brings together all of the different partners for a long-term project, because this isn't something that's going to be just done in a year. But it also introduces the whole concept of feral control, and we know, and you're exactly right, South Australia and Australia have a shocking record both from land clearance but also through the introduction of feral predators, particularly cats and foxes. So this introduces that sort of concept of fencing off the boot and then slowly bringing it up to the ankle of Yorke Peninsula. Our role is very much about providing some conservation advice and input, but also then in breeding for release. So in fact I've got a couple of staff who are over in WA at the moment talking about woylies, so the brush-tailed bettong that will be part of the release program in Marna Bangara. So again, it's where do we bring our expertise and focus, and very much around community consultation, which we've got a lot of skills in, and then the breeding for release. Much the same way as we have done in the APY lands with the black rock wallaby. And again, that's been a project that's been going for years. The Bounce Back project originally, the zoo's got a long history of working in wallaby programs. I think Bounce Back was probably 25 years ago.
Well, if listeners want to hear about Bounce Back, John Schutz, the Chief Executive of the Environment Department, talked at length about that being a real legacy program in the podcast I recorded with him. And these projects do take a long time, because you've got, in the case of Marna Bangara, we're putting up a fence. We're working very closely with local landowners to try and rid that landscape of feral foxes, feral rabbits, mice and rats as well, which prey on particularly on the eggs of ground-dwelling birds. So we're going to fence off the bottom of the Yorke Peninsula. It's we have fenced it off. In fact, it's happened. It is an ambitious project. State government, the Northern and Yorke Landscape Board, the zoos as one of our real fundamental partners in this project.
And it's also one that we've really been able to engage students in. We run a Duke of Edinburgh program and a zoo youth program, and we've taken passionate young conservationists to Innes National Park, and they do part of their learning there, but they also pick up rubbish when they're there, and so they're really hands-on. Getting involved in these projects.
And that's what it's all about, and very timely with the passing of the Duke of Edinburgh this week. And I am a Gold Award holder and former director of the Duke of Edinburgh's Award, and an organisation I have a huge amount of respect for. And
Zoo South Australia became the first ever international, or the first zoo internationally to become a formal partner of the Duke of Edinburgh scheme.
Well, that's a little bit of a tangent, but a very relevant one, given the death of His Royal Highness in the past few days. So with Marna Bangara, you identify a species that used to be part of that landscape. And in a practical way, where do you go from there? Because I'm sure our listeners are wondering, how do you actually breed them? How do you actually then go about releasing them and make sure they don't just become victims to the foxes or even the native predators like the raptors, which have we are proud to see down there?
Yeah, and it is sometimes it's a bit of trial and error, and sometimes it's, so for an example, we've been working with the Mallee emu wren, which is a little bird that's never ever been held in captivity before. And so we use a sort of surrogate species, if you like, until we learn the best mechanisms for successful holding and breeding of a bird that's, like about 5 grams when it's full size. It's part of the learnings in Western Australia at the moment with some of my staff talking about betons. So, but we don't ever do a breed and then an instant release. We often use what we call hardening areas. So we would breed an animal and then release it into a fenced area. If I use the APY lands, because we've been doing the work with the black-flanked rock wallaby there. We will do some breeding at Monarto, and then take some of the wallabies into the pinchy, as it's called, which is a fenced, controlled area. They have radio collars, and then we work with the local anangu and train them as rangers, so that we're sort of taking things step by step before you go to a full release to the wild. And zoos, across Australia and New Zealand do amazing research into what's going to get the best results. I know in Zoos Victoria they were trying to train some captive bred animals into how to recognise raptors, because it's not that necessary instinct. So how do you condition, and every time you see a big raptor flying over you make lots of noise,
a bush somewhere and get out of the way.
So trying to in some ways train the animal into have that hide instinct. So and that's why these projects are long-term projects.
The hard work.
And hard work, and also done with a lot of science input and knowledge. So we work really closely with all 3 universities, often have PhD students involved. We've done the same with the pygmy blue-tongued lizard, which was bred for the first time in captivity by Monarto a couple of years ago. And that now we've got some PhD students doing that study of how do you best do the release. So that's, again, another reason why they're not short-term projects, they're not cheap projects. And then you have to commit to them. So if you are releasing animals to the wild, you have to then, and we send staff regularly to do feral controls, because otherwise we're really breeding animals to become food for
I guess
foxes.
You've got to top up the populations for a period of time while they are getting established and working things out.
Absolutely, and you see that with the Tasmanian Devil Project, where there's now, we were one of the first zoos to get involved, but there's now I think 19 partner zoos. And it's a very detailed annual process of who should breed with who, then who's best to be released, so that we know what the genetic makeup is in the different parts of Tasmania. So again, it's not trial and error. There's a huge amount of science that goes into every one of these projects, but they help save species from extinction, and that's what we're about.
And again, I'm sure our listeners are learning a lot about the zoo's work, because it's while a day out at the zoo with your walk around this beautiful environment and your ice cream and your photographs with your kids is a great outcome of zoos. It helps people fall in love with nature and hopefully inspires people to look more closely at conservation. I don't think the extent of your conservation efforts are as well known as they should be, and it's one of the reasons I wanted to do this podcast, to help get that message out to I'm not exactly going to go viral here, but I hope a few more people will hear about the zoo's immense work here.
And I think some of the recent television programs, I know Taronga Zoo has been doing a TV show, Zoos Victoria. I think they are starting to showcase some of that broader work and the things that people just simply, I guess, haven't given thought to about, the challenges of how do you bring a new tiger into Australia. What are some of the other impacts of COVID? Well, we were trying to do animal transfers when borders were closed, and you've got birds that only have a really short breeding window. We don't want to lose the whole breeding season. So how do you try and do border transfers, which we did, which was an interesting challenge. But they're the things that go on behind the scenes that I guess you're right, our day visitors don't see, and we just want to open the doors a little bit to that.
The role of Zoos SA is certainly an extensive and diverse one. Now, Elaine, as we wind up the podcast, I just want to run through a few short questions which I've asked to all of the people that I've interviewed so far. So firstly, favourite animal, favourite type of animal. It doesn't need to be a native species, but what animal inspires you or excites you when you see it and learn about it?
Well, my favourite, and you know, I was given advice when I became the zoo director that a zoo director should never ever answer this question. But before I started at the zoo, and ever since I've been a young child, I've always been fascinated by the wombat. I just think wombats have great personality, character, but I could name just about every one of my species that we have at the zoo. And
do you have wombats at the zoo?
We do indeed. One of them did get nicknamed EB for a little while.
Okay, charming.
But no, it's because my staff know that I love them. But yes, no, we have Harriet, who's a bit of a character.
Fantastic. Now, your favourite park in South Australia. I'm the Minister for National Parks and Wildlife, obviously, so we ask this of all my guests. Your favourite national park, conservation park in the state?
I think Innis is absolutely stunning.
Down there.
Although having said that, I've just recently, and it was the first time I've had time to really explore through Port Lincoln.
Lincoln National Park,
and that was absolutely stunning.
Well, the Eyre Peninsula, that bit further away, but an absolutely stunning park. Innis National Park, Innis being a Scottish name, maybe that's part of the appeal to you. But those cliffs, those offshore islands, those secluded beaches, it's beautiful down there, and obviously forms really the largest protected area within the Marna Bangarra project, which we've just talked about at length, and really the success of that project will be based on having such a significant piece of protected land with behind that fence, while also expanding the project into the agricultural land as well. Favourite person to go a walk in a park with? Who is your favourite person to go a walk in a park with?
I'd have to say my husband, or I'll be in real serious trouble.
Fair enough. or just don't send him the link to the podcast. And do you get out and about? Do you have time to go out to parks and into the great outdoors other than the zoo?
Not a lot of time, I must say. It's this is pretty much a 360-day-a-year job. And when I do go out, I've got a big German Shepherd, and they're not allowed to be taken into most of the parks, and so I tend to just be walking with my dogs.
Fair enough. You can take dogs into
some parks,
Glenthorne National Park down south, our newest national park, so please come and visit that one. Now, next question is, name someone who has inspired you in terms of conservation, perhaps a South Australian, perhaps someone further afield, a conservation giant, someone that and it might not be someone necessarily known to our listeners, it doesn't need to be someone famous, but someone in the conservation world who has inspired you.
I mean, there's so many unknown, people who are doing so much of this critical work. I'd say, Liv Olds, who's our conservation manager, who's just tireless. But I think personally, I would go to someone who is very famous because she was a childhood hero, and then I was just blessed to have had time now to meet her on a number of occasions, and that's Dr. Jane Goodall, who I think has just inspired so many people. And when you see and listen to Dr. Jane talking to a group of students, it is just quite phenomenal. And
Jane visited South Australia and the zoo a couple of years ago, and a Parliament was sitting tragically. It's bad when Parliament sits at the best of times, but it stopped me meeting with Jane. But she took the time out to spend about 15 minutes on the phone with me, talking to me about her journey, and particularly the environment in South Australia. A truly inspiring woman. And I know she's still hopeful that she will get another visit to see us at some stage. Well, here's hoping. We are all hoping. Here's hoping we can sort those international borders out. Final question, Elaine. The title of this podcast is "The Best Time to Plant a Tree," and it is based on that old proverb, the old saying that the best time to plant a tree was a long time ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago, whatever. Insert the date, but we know the second best time to plant a tree is right now, as soon as possible. A practical, tangible, environmental outcome. If you could give one piece of advice around conservation to our listeners, something that they should be doing now if they want to make a difference for our environment, what would it be?
The single biggest one, I would say, would be to all of the cat owners, and I'm not demonising cats. I own a cat. Cats should be inside. The damage that is done to our native wildlife by cats, especially at night, is phenomenal. And that's a really simple, easy thing that every cat owner could do from about 2 hours' time.
That's a really very good piece of advice. I had a lengthy discussion with Professor Chris Daniels in my last podcast about the problem of cats, the challenge of cats. Are cats an issue in the zoo? Do they come in here?
No, but we do have a lot of controls around the zoo. But certainly we get to see the damage that cats do with just about every one of our conservation projects. And as I said, I'm certainly not looking to demonise cats. In fact, we're working on a project at the moment in conjunction with the RSPCA that we'll be launching very soon called Safe Cats, Safe Wildlife. You know, if you think back, I think back to when I was a child growing up, and dogs pretty much used to roam the streets. I had a dog that
That's exactly what Chris Daniels said. Exactly.
And it wasn't seen as a bad thing. But now, if nobody would see you as a responsible dog owner if you let your dog just wander the streets. And so how do we change that perception and say to be a good cat owner, to keep your cat safe, it'll stop it being, hit by cars or attacked by dogs, etc. A safe cat is an inside cat, and that has the benefit of saving wildlife as well.
And I know as Environment Minister, I have a little bit of legislative work to do to make this a better regime as well. So both your advice and that of Professor Daniels have been a go to action for me. Elaine Bensted, Chief Executive of Zoos SA, thank you for joining us on the podcast today. Good luck with all your work at the zoos, and in particular the Monarto project, which is going to be really exciting. I really appreciate your time, and I look forward to catching up soon.
Thank you very much. And of course, I would remind everybody we are a conservation charity. Any donations fully tax deductible and goes towards our conservation work.
So if people do want to make a donation to the zoo, they can pop onto the zoo's website, which is
zoossa.com.au.
Excellent. Elaine, thank you very much.